Mrs. Margaret never liked James, her granddaughter Lily's fiancé. The day Lily had brought James home to meet her family was meant to be a joyous occasion, a celebration of the union that was about to take place. But as soon as Mrs. Margaret laid eyes on him, something shifted in the room. "Who is he?" she asked sharply, her gaze narrowing as she studied James with an unsettling intensity. "My fiancé, Mema," Lily replied, a nervous smile on her face, trying to ease the tension. But Mrs. Margaret, for reasons best known to her, didn't look at James twice. "James Edward," she muttered under her breath, almost as though she was speaking to herself. Her words sent a ripple of unease through the room. The family fell silent, unsure of what to make of her reaction. "Have we met before?" James asked, smiling politely, trying to brush off the odd moment with his usual charm. But Mrs. Margaret's response was as cold as ice. "I don't like you," she said bluntly, standing up from her seat and walking briskly out of the room. There was a heavy silence after she left, and Lily, feeling the weight of the moment, quickly tried to dismiss the tension. "Baby, she's just an old woman, probably having a mood swing," Lily reassured James, her voice filled with uncertainty. Mr. and Mrs. Lucky, Lily's parents, exchanged awkward glances before Mr. Lucky chuckled softly. "Grandma can be quite troublesome," Mr. Lucky scoffed, trying to lighten the mood. "Welcome, my son," Mrs. Lucky added warmly, offering James a seat with a broad smile. "We are glad to meet you at last," she said, dismissing what seemed like a little misunderstanding. But Lily couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The way her grandmother had looked at James, the coldness in her tone, it didn't sit well with her. She glanced at the door, wondering what had caused her grandmother to react the way she did. They all sat down, the atmosphere slowly returning to normal as they began having casual conversations. James, eager to make a good impression, tried to engage with Lily's parents, asking about their lives and sharing a few anecdotes of his own. "So, how did you two meet?" James asked, directing the question to Mr. and Mrs. Lucky with a smile. Mrs. Lucky beamed at the question. "Oh, it was many years ago," she began, her voice warm with nostalgia. "We met at a local charity event. He was volunteering, and I was organizing. I never thought much about him at first until he made me laugh with his terrible jokes." Mr. Lucky chuckled, shaking his head in mock disapproval. "She didn't think I was funny at all, but here we are, 20 years later." They all laughed, and for a moment, it seemed like everything was settling into a comfortable rhythm. Lily smiled, glad to see that James was making an effort to fit in, but she couldn't shake the memory of her grandmother's strange behavior. "Are you both excited about the wedding?" Mrs. Lucky asked, glancing at her daughter and James. "Very excited," Lily said, her eyes sparkling with anticipation. "We've been planning for months, and everything is coming together. I can't wait to marry James." James nodded, his smile genuine. "I'm looking forward to it, too. It feels like we've been talking about this day forever." As the conversation continued, Mrs. Lucky stood and made her way to the kitchen. A few moments later, she returned with a large plate of fried rice, the rich scent of the dish filling the air. "Here you go," she said, placing the plate in front of James with a smile. "I hope you like fried rice. It's one of our family's favorites." James looked at the plate, his stomach growling slightly. "It smells amazing, thank you," he said, eagerly helping himself to a serving. As everyone dug in, the tension seemed to ease, though Lily couldn't quite shake the unease that still lingered. Her grandmother's words echoed in her mind, "I don't like you." It was as if there was something hidden beneath the surface of her grandmother's cold demeanor, something Lily couldn't understand. Suddenly, a loud thud came from the direction of the hallway, the unmistakable sound of a door slamming. Everyone froze. Lily's heart sank, and she looked toward the door leading to her grandmother's room. Her eyes met her mother's, who seemed equally concerned. "Grandma," Lily murmured, her voice barely a whisper. Mr. Lucky sighed, setting his fork down. "She's probably just tired. Don't worry about her, dear," he said, his tone reassuring. As the evening drew to a close, it was time for James to leave. He and Lily stood, ready to say their goodbyes, with Lily promising to return soon. The warmth of the night still lingered in the air, but the tension from earlier had settled into an awkward silence. Just as they reached the door, Mrs. Margaret appeared from nowhere, her presence so sudden that it startled everyone in the room. "Lily, I want to speak to you," she said, her voice commanding, yet tinged with something darker, something unsettling. Her eyes locked onto Lily's, and in that moment, it was as if the whole room held its breath. The surprise in the air was palpable. Lily's heart began to race as her grandmother's words echoed in her mind. She had been trying to brush off the tension, trying to pretend it was all just nerves before the wedding, but now, standing in front of her grandmother, she felt an unfamiliar chill. "Grandma, why are you so moody today and making this young couple's faces challenges?" Mr. Lucky's voice broke through the stillness, his tone sharp but trying to keep the peace. "As long as they are happy, I don't care if you like him or not." Mrs. Lucky nodded, offering James a reassuring smile. "James, you have our blessings. You are a nice man, and I see my daughter is happy." James, clearly uncomfortable with the tension but trying to remain polite, responded with a calm smile. "Thank you, Ma and Sir. We will take our leave then." But as James turned to leave, Mrs. Margaret's voice rang out again, this time firm and unyielding. "You can go, Mr. James, but I want to speak with my granddaughter," she insisted, her grip on the situation tightening. Lily, still unsure of why her grandmother was acting this way, glanced at James, who gave her a small, uncertain nod before stepping out the door. "Baby, please just go. I will meet you at home," Lily said softly, trying to make sense of her grandmother's sudden insistence. With a reluctant sigh, James left, leaving Lily alone with her grandmother. The weight of the room seemed to grow heavier as the door clicked shut behind him. Mrs. Margaret's expression remained unreadable as she turned to Lily, her gaze dark and intense. "Okay, what is this about?" Mr. Lucky said, facing his mother, Grandma Margaret. His tone was frustrated, but his eyes held an edge of concern. "This is so bad, it's his first day, Mama," Mrs. Lucky added, her voice tinged with disbelief. Grandma Margaret, undeterred, was unwavering in her response. "She can't marry him." The shock in the room was immediate. Mr. Lucky let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "And why is that?" he asked, his tone almost mocking. Lily, standing still in the background, felt the weight of her grandmother's words settle like a heavy stone in her chest. She had hoped things would calm down, that the tension would ease, but it was only growing thicker by the second. She finally found her voice, the hurt evident in her words. "Granny, I don't like how you speak to my fiancé. If you have a problem with him, you could have waited until later, not make him look like a bad person. James is a good man, and he is my choice." Grandma Margaret's face was set, her lips tight as she delivered her next words. "You can't marry him, and that's final." Lily felt a wave of anger rush through her. "Why?" Mrs. Lucky interjected, her voice trembling with confusion and disbelief. "No questioning, just listen," Grandma Margaret snapped, her voice cold. She turned her gaze back to Lily, who was now visibly upset, her hands shaking at her sides. Lily's chest tightened as she looked between her parents. "I can't leave James, and that's final. Mum, Dad, please speak to Grandma. I don't like this," she said, her voice rising as she stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind her. The house was silent for a moment, and Mr. Lucky and Mrs. Lucky both turned to Grandma Margaret, who remained standing in the same spot, her gaze distant. "Mama, this is unfair," Mrs. Lucky began, her voice trembling with frustration. "Why are you killing the excitement of planning Lily's wedding?" Mr. Lucky stepped forward, his frustration growing. "I mean, if you have something you know that could stop them from getting married, then say it. Not all this throwing tantrums. Are you the one getting married?" he said, his tone now sharp, a mixture of disbelief and irritation. With that, he turned and walked toward his room. "I'm done with this," he muttered under his breath as his wife followed, leaving Grandma Margaret standing there, unmoving, in the wake of the confrontation. Lily arrived home to find James pacing nervously in the living room, his expression filled with concern. The tension from the earlier encounter with her grandmother had weighed heavily on her, and now, seeing James so worried, only deepened the feeling of unease. "Hey," James said, stepping forward as soon as he saw her. "What happened? What did I do wrong with your grandmother? I don't understand. I've never seen her before." Lily sighed and walked over to him, taking his hands in hers. She could see the genuine confusion in his eyes, and it pained her to know that he had no idea why her grandmother had acted the way she did. "James," she said softly, reassuring him with a calm smile. "She's just an old woman. Sometimes she doesn't make sense." She had nothing reasonable to say. "Don't worry about it. She's just being mean for no reason." James looked at her, still troubled. "But Lily," it felt like she knew something, like there was something I was missing. "What's going on? I want to make things right." Lily kissed him on the cheek gently. "I know you want to, but you don't need to worry about her. Let's just focus on us, okay? This is our time now. Don't let her get into your head." Though James wasn't completely convinced, he nodded, trying his best to calm down. He wasn't used to such hostility, especially from a family member. But Lily was right, he couldn't let it ruin their happiness. The weeks passed quickly, and the wedding day was fast approaching. The preparations were going smoothly, and despite the lingering unease, everything was falling into place. It was going to be one of the biggest celebrations the town had ever seen. James, being financially secure, spared no expense to make the wedding as grand as possible. The venue was a lavish garden hall, with sparkling chandeliers, a grand staircase, and lush floral arrangements. There would be hundreds of guests, and every detail, from the food to the music, had been carefully planned to perfection. Lily couldn't help but feel excited. This was the day she had been dreaming about. And with James by her side, she believed it would be everything she had ever hoped for. But even as the wedding plans unfolded seamlessly, Lily couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that something was off. Her grandmother's words and actions still echoed in her mind, and the closer the wedding got, the more her doubts seemed to grow. James, on the other hand, was determined to make it the happiest day of their lives. He kept reassuring Lily that everything would be fine, but deep down, he couldn't help but wonder if the shadow of Grandma Margaret's disapproval would linger over them, threatening to ruin everything they had worked so hard for. Soon, it was the day of the wedding. Lily stood in front of the mirror in her wedding gown, looking breathtaking. She smiled, happy that it was finally her day. Meanwhile, Grandma entered the wedding hall in a red flowing gown and located Mr. and Mrs. Lucky, who were sitting with other family members. "What are you doing here?" Mr. Lucky asked, amused. "I thought you said no wedding." "This place is beautiful," Grandma said, ignoring him as she sat with them. "No drama today, Mama," Mrs. Lucky said. "We won't tolerate it," Mr. Lucky added. Lily's heart was racing with joy as her father, Mr. Lucky, took her arm and began to walk her down the aisle. The crowd rose to their feet, their faces filled with excitement and smiles. The moment was finally here, the culmination of months of planning, hopes, and dreams. Lily's heart swelled with happiness as she glanced at James, who stood at the altar, his eyes filled with love and anticipation. James's expression softened when he saw her, and he couldn't help but smile. She was breathtaking. She had never looked more beautiful. The ceremony proceeded, the vows exchanged, each word echoing through the grand hall as they promised to love and cherish each other for a lifetime. The couple exchanged rings, sealing their commitment with a kiss. The cheers of the crowd filled the air, and just like that, they were married. As the ceremony came to an end, the music shifted, signaling the start of the reception. The dance floor was ready, and the guests gathered around, eager to celebrate the newlyweds. Lily and James shared their first dance as husband and wife. The rhythm of the music seemed to sync with their hearts, their eyes locked on one another as they moved across the floor. Friends, family, colleagues, and well-wishers surrounded them, cheering and clapping as the celebration continued. Money was sprayed into the air, the sounds of laughter and joy filling every corner of the room. It was a night to remember. And then, it happened. Grandma Margaret, who had been quietly observing from her seat, stood up. The room seemed to hush as everyone turned their attention to her. With surprising grace, she made her way to the dance floor, moving toward Lily and James. Lily's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't believe her eyes. The same woman who had been so adamantly against her marriage to James was now approaching them with a broad smile on her face. Was this really happening? Lily's mother, Mrs. Lucky, watched from the sidelines, her eyes narrowing in suspicion. She was on edge, watching to see if Grandma Margaret would pull any stunts. But instead, the moment took a strange turn. "Happy married life, my girl," Grandma Margaret said, her voice surprisingly warm as she pulled Lily into a tight hug. "Your new home is blessed." Lily stood frozen, too stunned to respond. She could hardly believe what she was hearing. Was this really the same woman who had tried to stop her from marrying James? James, too, was taken aback, his expression one of confusion and surprise. He exchanged a glance with Lily, unsure of what to make of this sudden shift in behavior. Without another word, Grandma Margaret reached into her purse and pulled out a handful of cash, spraying it into the air with a flourish. The crowd cheered, clearly amused by her boldness. She then danced back to her seat, leaving Lily and James in stunned silence. But just as the celebration seemed to resume, a wave of dizziness hit Lily. Her vision blurred, and her head began to spin uncontrollably. She felt a cold sweat form on her brow as everything around her seemed to tilt. Before she could react, the world around her spun too fast, and with a loud thud, Lily collapsed to the floor. The music screeched to a halt, and the room went silent as people rushed to her side. James was by her instantly, panic flashing across his face as he knelt beside her. "Lily," he cried, shaking her gently. "Lily, wake up." The crowd watched in horror as the once joyous celebration turned into a scene of chaos. James's heart raced as he cradled Lily's head in his lap, his hands trembling. The guests were in shock, whispering among themselves, unsure of what had just happened. Mrs. Lucky rushed to her daughter's side, kneeling beside James and gently trying to help him lift Lily. "What's happening to her?" Mrs. Lucky asked, her voice filled with panic. "I don't know," James replied, his voice cracking with fear. "She just collapsed. 1 minute she was fine, and then, this." Grandma Margaret, still sitting at her table, watched the scene unfold with an unreadable expression. Mrs. Lucky turned to her, her eyes flashing with anger and suspicion. "You, Mama," she said, her voice trembling with frustration. "What did you do? What's going on? Why did she collapse like this?" Grandma Margaret stood up slowly, as though the chaos in the room didn't concern her in the slightest. She walked over to where Lily lay, her old feet shuffling across the floor. "I didn't do anything," she said softly, her tone distant and cold, almost too calm for the situation. Lily's body remained limp in James's arms, her breathing shallow but steady. Mrs. Lucky, desperate, motioned for someone to call an ambulance. As they waited, time seemed to stretch on, each second feeling like an eternity. The once joyous atmosphere of the wedding had now turned to one of dread. The guests murmured anxiously, their eyes shifting from Lily to Grandma Margaret, wondering what had caused this sudden turn of events. After what felt like an eternity, the ambulance arrived, and the paramedics rushed in, quickly taking control of the situation. James and Mrs. Lucky exchanged frantic glances as Lily was carefully loaded onto a stretcher. "I'll go with her," James said, his voice firm but tinged with panic. "I need to be there." Mrs. Lucky nodded, her face pale as she fought to keep her composure. "Go, James. I'll be right behind you." Lily's parents stood frozen for a moment, staring at the lifeless form of their daughter as the paramedics worked to revive her. Mrs. Lucky's hands shook as she clutched onto James's arm for support. The once joyful wedding celebration had turned into a nightmare in an instant, and she could hardly believe what was happening. "Why? What happened?" Mrs. Lucky whispered, her voice barely audible as tears welled up in her eyes. "She was fine just moments ago." James was on the verge of tears, his voice cracking with fear as he gently held Lily's hand, unwilling to let go. "Please, Lily, wake up. I need you." Meanwhile, Mr. Lucky was standing off to the side, his face a mix of disbelief and anger. His gaze slowly turned toward his mother, who was still seated calmly at her table, watching the scene unfold as if nothing was wrong. "Mama." Mr. Lucky's voice was sharp, filled with frustration. He moved quickly toward her, his eyes blazing with anger. "What did you do to her? What did you do to my daughter?" Grandma Margaret looked up at him, her expression unbothered, as if she had expected this confrontation. She slowly stood up from her seat and faced her son. "I warned her," she said, her voice cold, her words laced with an eerie finality. Mr. Lucky's heart skipped a beat as her words hit him like a slap in the face. "Warned her? Warned her about what? He asked, his voice rising with frustration. What does that even mean, Mama? Margaret's gaze remained steady, her tone unyielding. I warned her about the consequences of defying the family's path. You all think you can escape what's been set in motion for generations, but you can't. Mr. Lucky was speechless for a moment, his mind racing. His mother's cryptic words only made the situation more confusing, and the anger boiling inside him made it hard to think clearly. I can't do this right now, he muttered, his fists clenched. I need to go with her. Without another word, Mr. Lucky rushed to the paramedics, who were just finishing stabilizing Lily. They quickly wheeled her out to the waiting ambulance, with James following closely behind. Mrs. Lucky, her face pale with worry, was right behind them. Back in the wedding hall, the guests were left in stunned silence, unsure of what to do. The joyful atmosphere from earlier had disappeared, replaced by a sense of dread and confusion. Mr. Lucky, sensing the tension in the air, took a deep breath and turned to face the room. He wiped the sweat from his forehead and cleared his throat before stepping forward. He needed to say something to ease the growing unease. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, his voice calm but firm, trying to mask the anxiety he felt. As you can see, my daughter has collapsed. She's in good hands now, and the doctors are doing everything they can. The wedding has been a long process, and Lily worked so hard to make everything perfect. He paused, glancing around the room, meeting the eyes of the guests who were still on edge. This is nothing more than the result of exhaustion. She's been through a lot recently, and her body just couldn't take the strain. There's nothing to worry about. A few guests nodded in understanding, though the tension remained. But Mr. Lucky pressed on, his voice becoming more reassuring. So, we're going to take care of her, and in the meantime, I ask you all to please enjoy the celebration. We'll continue the party as planned, and we'll update you all as soon as we know more about Lily's condition. The room began to settle, and slowly, the guests returned to their seats, though their faces were still filled with concern. The music resumed, a little quieter now, and the party continued, though without the newlyweds. As the festivities unfolded in the absence of Lily and James, the air was thick with questions, but the celebration pushed on. The dancers moved across the floor, the laughter and chatter resumed, but everyone knew the wedding had been altered forever. And as the night carried on, one question hung in the air: what was really happening to Lily?